I'd like to call this meeting of the Bellingham City Council Public Works Public Safety Committee to order. Joining me on the committee is Jack Weiss and Michael Lilliquist, who I'm assuming will be here shortly. Going to do things, we've got 3 items on our agenda today, and we're going to do things a little bit out of order from the agenda. We're going to do the request for variance first, as is on the schedule, but I'm going to switch around the bicycle master plan with the proposed ordinance amending municipal code related to parking, so we can make sure we get through the bicycle master plan and things. So the first item up is the request for variance to allow nighttime construction on the Aldridge Road to minimize disruption to Cordata Elementary School. My understanding with this one, it's a little different than usual because the developer is requesting the variance as opposed, and it's not as opposed to the city, which is usually a city project, or it's not a city project.
Right.
And so I've been asked to, during this, if it would be okay for the developer to speak on this, and if that's the case, from Public Works about this, I will allow that.
Okay.
So I'll open it up to you. And I understand Ted's doing civic duty this morning, so he probably won't. Ted Carlson, the director, probably won't be here.
That's right. He's on jury duty this morning.
Yes.
So for the record, I'm Brent Baldwin, Development Manager for the Public Works Department. I don't actually see the developer here this morning,
okay.
So I'll run through the request for him. It is a little bit different than we typically see. We've done, excuse me, noise variances for capital projects before, but at least in my time here with the city, I haven't seen one done with a private development. So what the request was for was to do nighttime work to allow the closure of Aldrich Road to install a stormwater conveyance pipe. The pipe has to go down the middle of the road because of conflicts with other utilities. In doing that, because of the depth of the pipe, it's going to be extremely difficult to keep the road open. As you know, Cordata Elementary School is the primary access is from the south coming north on northbound on Aldrich to the school. So the intent from the developer was to do this at night to limit the impact to the school district itself. Their desire is there's a Friday closure of the school in October. That's a normal scheduled day off for the school. So their hope was to hit that date to try to lessen the impacts as much as possible.
Okay. Any questions from committee? Michael and Jack?
How many residents are in the area that might be affected by this, and how close are they?
Well, adjacent to the project itself, I believe there's 5 residences along there. That does not include any of the houses north of the school, which would also be obviously impacted if they're trying to head south.
Well, I guess my question, I know there'll be some traffic disruption. I'm also wondering about just the nighttime sleep disruption. The ones to the north are probably outside of earshot for the most part, or will they all be affected by the noise?
Most likely they won't be tremendously affected by the noise. Obviously you can hear excavators and things from a distance, but the applicants did let us know that they would be contacting each individual property owner prior to the construction if it was approved, and work out whatever they need to work out for accommodations.
Jack?
So Brent, this project's been on the books for many years.
Long time.
And how long has the developer known about the fact that they need to put in a stormwater pipe?
For some time, they've been working through the entire summer to work out a design for this. What this pipe will do is actually alleviate some of the flooding issues that have occurred because of a previous design that isn't working well. So it has been within their knowledge for quite some time, but the drive right now and the timing schedule really revolves around getting the project done before the fisheries windows close, which is, I believe, October 15th for the actual outfall. That part is in the county, and they're working with the county to get that done ahead of time. What this will do then is relieve the rest of the flooding issue so that they can start on their next phase of development, which is actually, if you look at the map, you can see June Road and the little leg roads coming off to the north. It'd be on that end of it. It'll be a multifamily phase.
But they really could have done this during the summer if they, because
If everything worked right, yeah, I think they could have.
it just really kind of irks me to have to go through this type of process when when the mismanagement of timing and planning these improvements could have been done a lot better.
Right,
They should have been able to figure this one out.
yeah.
Okay. So, Michael,
One final question. You said that they would be working with those 5 most adjacent property owners for accommodations. What form do those accommodations typically take?
That wasn't clarified to us. They just said that they would do what they needed to do to work with the neighbors to make sure that they're aware of the construction, and if there is any needs associated with the construction, that they would handle that. But they didn't expand upon that to me.
Well, I hope they do accommodate in whatever way is necessary, but I'm going to go ahead and move that we recommend approval of this construction noise variance.
okay, we have a motion before us to approve the noise variance. All those in favor of recommending to the full council tonight, answer aye.
Aye.
Okay, we will do that tonight. Our next item will be continuation of working on the bicycle master plan. So I believe we had, at this point, well, at our last session, we had worked through, was it 9 or 10 of the questions that Jack had raised. And since that time, questions had been submitted to Public Works and written responses given to the questions. So I guess I'd bring it back to committee to, and probably to you first, Jack, to go through if there's any items or whatever you feel we need to be discussed at a greater length. Or clarifications that you wanted.
We're just getting passed out the hard copy of what was sent to us a few days ago.
Thanks for printing it.
You need a copy?
One copy for...
Can you get us one copy over here?
Oh yeah, I've got copies already. There you go.
Well, I guess what I'm going to do is maybe, while we're working on the questions that we hadn't resolved from
Right.
last meeting, we'll just start from there. But I had some follow-up questions on some of the responses that were in here from before.
Okay, so do we need to work through each question with the answers, with the responses? Is that?
Some of them.
Okay, so let's go with the ones that you think need to be or whatever, instead of, if there are ones that we don't have to, then let's, proceed that way. That's one of the reasons we asked be in writing, so that we would hopefully have the answers and we wouldn't need to discuss everything,
Okay. Well, I'm going to.
re-discuss everything.
I'm just going to go and pick them out of no particular order. I'm just
Okay.
going to see something I have here, and then I'm going to ask the question, and
Okay.
I might skip around.
I wasn't either.
So on my question number 13 and 14, which is under Chapter 6,
13 and 14,
questions number 13
Yeah.
and 14.
Chapter 6.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Rory was prepared to do a small presentation that
Oh,
answers
okay.
some of the
Yeah.
questions
Okay,
before.
I'm sorry,
mean,
I didn't.
If you want to do it, if you wanted to see if
That's
some
great.
of your
Okay.
questions
Is
are
that-
answered.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that good?
great.
That's fine,
so.
I'm sorry, I
Okay.
just
Okay.
jumped right into it.
I think what Terry
That's
was
okay.
wanting to do
Well, I didn't
is,
want to distract you, but
Yeah.
anyways,
I think what Terry was wanting to do was to just kind of streamline the process by, if you had responded in writing and it was fine,
Right.
let's just move
Yeah.
on to something
yeah.
else.
No, I'm fine.
So we've got about a 5-minute presentation. I'll
great.
go ahead and turn it over to Kim to
Okay.
go
Sorry,
ahead.
I
Yeah, we've been working on
apologize
this for a
that.
year
I'm
and a
just-
half, so we do want to move it
It's all
forward.
fired up and raring to go here.
So I didn't want to delay the approval,
Good.
but go ahead, Kim.
Kim Brown, Public Works. We did submit responses to all of the questions asked, but we, at the last work session, there were some questions raised about the recommendation for a bike boulevard on Monroe Street, and staff has prepared a few slides, Chris Behe with Planning Department, to give you some background on the decision for that recommendation, as well as clarify some of the design details for bike boulevards.
Thank you. Yeah, Chris Behe, Planning Department. So the question at the last work session regarding why Monroe was chosen, I just have a couple of slides that just kind of highlight the thought process behind that. So what you see here is a section of the proposed network. Again, all the pink lines are the bike boulevards. The blue are the variety of different types of on-street bike lanes, the striped lanes. And you see right here going east-west through the middle of the neighborhood, this is the Monroe Street corridor. And I'm just going to go down through the list of bullets on the left of the slide here. One of the first things you notice is that we do have a couple of streets that run the full width of the neighborhood through both the lettered streets, the western portion of the lettered streets in Cornwall Park area and the Columbia neighborhood. Jefferson was one that we considered, but then the Columbia Elementary site itself, the street does not go through that site, so immediately you've got a jog that you'd have to insert in there. So we looked for the next parallel street, and Monroe Street shows up for a couple of reasons as being a good one, mainly because it does extend the full width of the neighborhood, and also on the extreme west end there's a convenient connection out to the Eldridge Avenue corridor there. And then looking on the east end of the corridor, there's an easy connection across Broadway onto Halleck Street, which is another bike boulevard that feeds and crosses Watcom Middle School, and then eventually down to the Ohio Street and Cornwall Avenue corridors. So there's some logic to that corridor. Looking at the rest of the neighborhood, west was chosen for its obvious connection down to Squalicum Parkway and between there and Eldridge. So it provides a good north-south connection with some key connectivity to other routes beyond. Victor was chosen as a parallel route. It's nicely offset kind of between the Elm Northwest corridor and West Street, and it does provide this connection across Northwest and Victor all the way over to the Cornwall Park area. So it's another, provides a longer trans-neighborhood connection. One example that we considered but did not choose, Lynn Street. Again, it is an arterial, collector arterial, and when possible, like we had said before, we try to avoid choosing collector arterials for bike boulevards. So we stayed away from it for that reason, and also because we do have the close spacing already of West Street and Victor as parallel routes. This is just illustrating kind of that trans-neighborhood connectivity that some of the other routes that might have initially made sense, the ones that we ended up with, provide those longer destination-based trans-neighborhood connections. So you can get those lower stress bike boulevard type connections going between a variety of neighborhoods and between places like the Bellingham Tech College and the downtown area, or if you're going northbound out to the Cornwall Park area. This was in the initial work session we made to you folks several weeks ago, just to illustrate again some of the variety of treatments that you might see on bike boulevards, the obvious on-street shared lane use of the Sharrow and the bike symbol, sometimes accompanied by the BLVD abbreviation for boulevard to kind of brand the route or identify to both drivers and to cyclists that they're on a bike boulevard. The green signage, which in the back of the proposed document, you get the variety of different types of standard signage for wayfinding. Here's an example of an enhanced crossing, this example being the Grant Street crossing on Alabama, but the button-activated beacon, or the slightly, more involved version being the hawk signal, where you actually get a red cycle, which will actually stop vehicle traffic at a stop bar. And then the traffic circles, which we've mentioned several times, this example being on Ellis Street. I'm just going to walk you through a series of preliminary design drawings that we've received from the consultant from Tool Design. This is the Young to Kentucky to Nevada to Texas Street Bike Boulevard corridor, and these 4 intersections I'm highlighting here at Cornwall, at James, at Texas, Nevada, and at Pacific Street in Texas are ones I'll just highlight some design level drawings we've gotten from them recently. So this is the corner of Cornwall, Kentucky, and then Young Street coming up from the downtown area, right on the corner of Bellingham High School in the southeast, and then the Assumption Catholic Church on the northeast there. So a couple of the improvements that are being proposed here are first to tee up the intersection on both sides. So you see these curb extensions. If you're familiar with this corner now, this is a large sweeping, large radius turn here where cars can come around that corner at significant speed. So extending this curb out 6 feet and then making it a sharper angle will slow traffic down as they make that turn and discourage motorists from taking that at higher speed. And then again here at the Young Cornwall intersection, just extending this curb out. Right now it is a large, shallower radius, teeing that intersection up so that both vehicles and cyclists are forced to treat this more as a T intersection. And then at the existing crosswalk here, inserting a crossing island in the middle so to shorten up the pedestrian crossing distance from both sides, and also provides a little bit of protection and guidance to cyclists. We've got a marking that would be stenciled here to direct cyclists to try and cross more perpendicular to traffic and then continue on the bike lanes and either continue north on Cornwall or to make the right turn onto the continuation of the bike boulevard in Kentucky. And again, another similar symbol here for the westbound trips, people coming on Kentucky, rather than a large fading turn which exposes them to being out in the travel lanes for a longer period of time, encouraging them to cross more perpendicular and merge more immediately with the bike lanes on the far side of Cornwall. Chris,
what does dark green indicate?
In this case, that's just an indication of, I think, the planting strips. It was really to delineate where the sidewalk pavement is. I think it's the consultant's attempt to show that there'd be some grass or something there, but it's curbing and grass and sidewalk. Moving on, this is the James Street, Kentucky intersection. Hardware Sales is right down here in the southeast corner. And so you'd see cyclists going east and west on this bike boulevard. And we have an existing pedestrian-activated beacon right on the north side of the intersection that stops traffic on James when pedestrians activate that button. You can see the additional red dots on the map here. Those would be additional activation points for that flashing beacon, both for pedestrians on the sidewalk, and then you can see at the edge of the area identified for cyclists here, curbside, so that cyclists could reach out on some kind of a post and activate that without having to mount the sidewalk and confuse either vehicle or pedestrian traffic and create potential conflicts. And then as they cross the intersection, you'd see the use of green paint to both indicate for cyclists where they should be crossing, but also to call attention for motorists that they should be expecting to see cyclists in those areas and to be cautious as they approach. And then the addition on the south side of the intersection, in this scenario, the flashing beacons remain on the pole or standard on the north side of the intersection, but we've added a stop bar at the south side to encourage motorists to stop at the stop bar rather than occupying the intersection as they're waiting for pedestrians to clear. And so that gives cyclists the clear zone that they need to cross in front of the stopped vehicles.
Chris, can I interrupt for a second? Is this a Tier 1 project, or do you know where this is in the priority list, medium-term, short-term?
The Kentucky Bike Boulevard, Kentucky, Texas, Nevada, was one of our highest ranked projects. It's a Tier 1. It was the second. It was the second highest ranked project, so it ranked very highly. Provides a really good connection between a lot of high-density housing and also the Barclay area, so you have a lot of employment out there, and also, of course, the downtown core area.
Thanks.
Okay.
This is the Nevada-Texas intersection, and this is, again, a use of what we had talked about before with the traffic circles. Today there are stop signs on Texas Street. Nevada has the right-of-way going through there north to south. So this would involve removing those stop signs and instead inserting one of these 16-foot diameter traffic circles, which would, again, slow traffic down, allow everybody to have a safe look at the intersection before proceeding through, and give cyclists an easy way to navigate through as well. So again, just a simple application, and we've seen these used around town, and they are simple to navigate for both cyclists and motorists. And finally, a few blocks further to the east at Pacific Street. This is Texas crossing Pacific. Just a block north of here is the Alabama intersection, and then a couple of blocks to the south is the Public Works Operations building. And so in this case, what the consultant has recommended, and they're showing bike lanes on Pacific here. Those do not exist today, but they're proposed in the plan. And so we would have those bike lanes inserted. They're showing a 6-foot curb extension on the west side of the intersection. And there would be, in this scenario, presumably the parking maintained, parallel parking maintained on that side of the street. And then the addition of the symbology across, or the markings going east-west across the intersection with the shared lane markings and the dashed lines to define the recommended travel lane for the cyclists, so they'd position themselves appropriately as they cross. We would still maintain stop signs on Texas Street, and then some appropriate signage for motorists traveling north and south to be cautious and to be aware that there is a bike boulevard there, and cyclists would be crossing, as well as pedestrians at the crosswalks. So that just gives you a flavor of a variety of treatments on what would be one of the first bike boulevards that we'd be looking at implementing. Again, everything from kind of leveraging existing things like the enhanced crossing we have on James Street and making it more accessible to cyclists, providing a little bit more direction in the way of some paint on the street. Cornwall involving some changes to the curb profiles, redirecting traffic, or not redirecting traffic, but steering them into the appropriate ways of using those intersections. And then here at Pacific Street, using, again, some curb extensions and using some extra paint to provide guidance for both motorists and cyclists. Okay, if there are any questions.
Jack, Michael?
So Chris, if you could go back to the first slide that I believe was talking about Monroe. Ted, at the last meeting, Ted asked me, well, what would I do? And so I took that as an invitation. And so I did go out there and tried to check and see what was going on. I guess the question, the one that I thought of at the time that he asked, but I wanted to verify the connection on the east side, was Washington Street, just directly south of Monroe. And to me, it has the similar type of attributes of Monroe, except for that Monroe is a collector arterial, and it does have substantially more cars on it than the other streets, parallel streets to Monroe. Washington Street is a fairly narrow street. It does have parking on one side, but it has the feel of what I perceive as a bicycle boulevard, which is very little traffic and the ability to, to be able to get a bicycle back and forth across. And it's also next to Elizabeth Park, and it can go and access over to Halleck, over to Halleck through the existing bike lanes on Broadway. So I don't know. Ted asked, I think that Washington Street would be a better one, but that's up to you guys to go and figure out. But I just think that if the purpose of bike boulevards is to try and minimize the interactions between cars and bicyclists, that we should do whatever we can. And to me, that means, first of all, choosing the streets that have minimal traffic, number one. And second is that another slide that was up there that was showing treatments of how to go and do various traffic calming. The one thing I didn't see was traffic diverters. And I think that if you want to really get cars off that particular street, but still allow for local access, you put in a traffic diverter. And you're allowing the bicyclists to go back and forth across it, but you're telling the vehicles that they need to choose a different street. That's, I don't know. That's what I've seen in other communities. I think that they are a lot further ahead than what our bike master plan is right now, if, what these other communities are doing compared to what we're anticipating doing. And I don't know, I would strongly encourage that when we look at treatments and implementation treatments, that we look at things that would really, I mean, if you're wanting us to establish policy, I would be promoting a policy of, to whatever extent that we could do, is to minimize the interaction between vehicles and bicycles.
Jack, and I understand your point. I'm wondering what other communities you're talking about.
Well, I was just on a trip very recently that I was in California and in Utah, and I saw treatments in Portland, Eugene, Marin County, and in Moab in Utah. There's 4 cities that had substantially more sophisticated types of infrastructure treatments than what we're proposing here. And so, I mean, those were the cities that I saw.
And sometimes I just want us to be aware that when we compare ourselves to Portland, when we compare ourselves to...
Well, Eugene is somewhat similar to us. Moab is actually smaller than us. Marin County is just rich, but...
Well, that would be helpful on this particular question. I think the staff was trying to maximize the access. See all the little streets that go down and the longer connection that we have? I think that was one of the reasons why, because we want as many people as possible to access these, I think. So I guess the criteria for picking a street, which includes the collector arterials, which you made a point about, which I think staff agrees about. But maybe you could analyze Jack's Washington Street proposal.
Oh, yeah, actually, the discussion on Monroe, actually, we had a healthy discussion with the Transportation Commission, too. And there was some disagreement even within the Transportation Commission on what to do to Monroe. But ultimately, Monroe needs to be access, it's the main access for emergency vehicles. And the fire department really wanted to make sure that that access remains. And so diverters, traffic calming is not an option on that.
That's why Washington Street would be better for Boulevard.
And ultimately, the bicyclists will be using what they're most comfortable with. Just because we're marking a street doesn't necessarily mean they have to use that. So,
I think what I was asking is to let Jack know why Washington is less desirable than Monroe.
Well, Washington doesn't directly connect to Eldridge and doesn't directly connect to Halleck.
Okay, it's got the same little jog that Monroe has on the Eldridge side. like almost identical amount of.
Sure. I think one of the main things is the full extent of Monroe Street, that it really does go all the way across the neighborhood. The other is the spacing between west, north, and it's another block down to Washington Street. A further thing is that a lot of kids walk to school, particularly to Wacom Middle School, along Monroe Street, and I think it's a route that is going to be utilized for cyclists and pedestrians, whether we mark a facility or not. And I think providing the safety improvements is a real benefit to those using that route. And the direct tie-in to Broadway and Halleck, I think are pretty important there. I also just wanted to mention one thing about traffic diverters. They are in our design guidelines. It definitely is a possible treatment. I'm sorry that we didn't have a photograph of that, but it is, in terms of the hierarchy of treatments, kind of like your last step, because it is a major treatment. You are blocking traffic. You have to consider whether you're bumping that motor vehicle traffic to another street. What issues are you causing with that? But it's definitely in our toolbox. And Chris, did you have anything else you wanted to add about the selection for Monroe?
No, I think you hit it. I think the north-south spacing was a key element, and then just looking for the one that had the greatest east-west extent, and the acknowledgement that, again, for the access to the schools, that it is sort of the trunk line that's currently used by the most users. And so while we're not proposing traffic diverters on Monroe, the signage, the on-street placement of markings to encourage cyclists to take the lane, to be as safe as they can be, both being out of the door zone of what cars are parked along there, but also to be visible to motorists coming east and west along that corridor, we felt that would be appropriate in that area.
Now, that gets into like one of the other questions that I had about would we run this, these very specific things with the scoring and various things with the individual neighborhoods? Because quite frankly, if I was living in the Columbia neighborhood and I had an elementary school child, would I want them to go and be bicycling on Monroe with it being a collector arterial, or would I want them to go and use one of the other side streets like Washington? And that if it's on Monroe and they've got to go and take the street, and that little kid's going and doing about 6 or 7 miles an hour, what's the tolerance level of the cars behind? That's the thing. It's this interaction between cars and bicycles that, I have no problem about bike boulevards, with the understanding that we're trying to minimize the vehicles. There's no problem about on Connecticut and North of having bicycles go and move over a block, but it seems like there's a big problem about having cars move over a block, with a diverter. And I'm not suggesting that we put diverters on Monroe. I'm suggesting that we create a different bike boulevard.
And I think your point about elementary school children, I think most elementary school kids, really the ones who would be biking might be the 4th and 5th graders. And if I wasn't comfortable as a parent, I would have my child use Jefferson or Washington, take those alternate routes. Or I would have them on the sidewalk. But I think middle schoolers are capable of navigating Monroe Street with the safety improvements.
Well, I've made my point, so, okay, good.
Michael, yeah.
Chris, could you go to Pacific Street? The question I want to, first of all, it's really exciting to see, even these early stage conceptual designs. I can imagine it happening. My question here has to do with why in this case, and why in general, we didn't flip the proposed bicycle lane on the west side with the bicycle lane and the parking lane. One way to protect bicycle lanes is to flip where the parking is, and it's a more radical but also more effective treatment. We didn't use it in this case. Why not? And when would we consider flipping the bike in the parking lane?
On this particular corridor, when you flip parking and with the bicycle lane, that is a treatment considered either a buffered bike lane or a cycle track. That's a treatment that's usually used where there's higher volume traffics, additional vehicle lanes. Pacific is a 2-lane street. There's more complications when you switch the parking with the bicycle lane at intersections, making bringing the bicycle back out so they can make the crossing, crossing driveways to businesses. There's less visibility for cyclists coming out, or for people coming across the driveway. So usually, if you're going to be making that switch between switching the sidewalk and bike lane, that's requiring some pretty major treatments at intersections, and would be a treatment you would do on a busier arterial corridor, perhaps like Holly Street or Lakeway, where you've got more travel lanes and faster moving traffic, higher volume, where you would want that additional separation.
Well, first of all, I'm pleased to see that there is different treatment for bike lanes along busier streets. You know, I mean, Jack's focusing on the potential conflict at the lower level on bike boulevards. I paid more attention to the potential conflict on arterials, which is why I like buffered bike lanes. What about Samish Way, when that's redeveloped as another candidate, bigger, wider street? Might that be a place where a buffered bike lane or a flipped parking bike lane might be considered in the future?
It might be, but again, we need to look at all the driveway access and intersection treatments. Those are the key things that you really need to take a look at. And if you can address the safety issues with that, then certainly it's an option.
With regard to bringing the bike lane weaving back in and to cross the intersection, that doesn't always have to occur. Sometimes you just simply drop the curb down and the bicycles can go through. Paint it properly, because now you're creating pedestrian bicycle potential conflicts. But we do it in some places near our roundabouts and other places in the city already, where we have a special flat section because the bike lane has to go through. But thanks for answering the question.
I think one like a additional treatment that, if it was warranted on Pacific Street, might be simply a buffer between the traveling cars in the bike lane. That would probably be a first step, considering the volumes of traffic on that street.
Like a kind of a 1-foot diagonal striped. Sure.
Right.
Okay. Jack?
As you do that investigation that you're talking with Michael about, I would encourage you to look at what Eugene is doing with their cycle track program in the downtown area.
Okay.
You know, I went there to go and buy something, and I was made to go and park in the middle of the street, right in the middle of the street. There's a travel lane on the right-hand side. There was a cycle track on the left-hand side. There was quite a bit of safety consideration going on with the bicyclists, and it seemed to work. And there's there was a lot of movement of everybody, pedestrians, vehicles, and bicyclists.
Right.
But it seemed to work.
I will definitely take a look at that one. We have been looking at applications in a number of different cities, because there's no one-size-fits-all cycle track, and there's some very exciting new possibilities. But again, it has to be looked at in each individual situation.
And in that one, too, it had a lot of businesses, and so there were a lot of access points.
Right.
You know, the same things that might want to deter us from doing something here, they seem to have been able to figure
Address
it out.
that. Okay.
Okay. Staff through with the presentation at this point? Okay, so we'll bring it back to the questions. So Jack, we'll go back to yours, and anything that you needed fleshed out more or
well, I guess I'm going to go back to the ones I was going to start with. And this, again, is for Chapter 6, and my questions number 13 and 14 had to do with just the presentation of the financials of what the plan might look like. I'm understanding that the question that I had asked is that on table 6.1, that we would show the 3 different tiered priorities and then how much would it cost associated with that. The response is that, you know, there's more of an aggregate in the Appendix B of what the projects might cost given Tier 1, 2, and 3. But what I thought would be very helpful is to find out, you know, on the way that we're looking at our priorities, what kind of priorities are we looking at with the different methods of bike treatments, bike lanes, the buffers, the cycle tracks, whatever it is, and how that pertains to, and I think Michael's was kind of pointing to this too, is the when. When do we get to those types of things? And are we going to just do a lot of very simple treatments right at first, or are we going to try and tackle some of the more complicated ones? And could that be actually represented in this table in a more expansive way to say, you know, Tier 1, we are going to be focusing on, you know, these types of methods of treatment, but we're not going to really look at these other ones until Tier 3. They're long-term projects, and we're just simply not going to look at it. Because I think that represents a fair look at what we're actually doing. So that was the purpose of that question.
Right. The plan isn't to just address the sort of easier bicycle treatments. One of the high-ranking project is, well, 2 of them are in the first tier, both Holly and Lakeway, and staff is recommending that those will need further study before we can even get a design element going, but staff is recommending that funding be allocated early on because those are high-priority projects and they're very important connectors to the system. So there's a variety of projects within the first tier, and whether they're bike boulevard, bike lane, buffered or cycle track, depending on what comes out of the further study needed. The prioritization is that these projects are important and we want to address them regardless of the facility type that is associated with them.
Michael?
Can I just, so what I'm hearing, and I know what I perceived, is the prioritization is based upon matters of equity, safety, and connectivity, which may mean that some of the hardest projects may still come first. Sort of the opposite of what Jack's suggesting. We bite off the easy ones first. This plan actually bites off a few of the hard ones first.
Mm-hmm.
And my primary point was just to present that in the table. Because right now, for me, I would have to go back between Appendix B and Table 6.1 and go back and forth and try and figure it out myself, where it seems like it would be very simple to just add a few more columns and put that in.
And we can do that, yeah.
And then the other, question 14 had to do with the design and contingency costs. I mean, those are real costs. I guess for purposes of budget planning and for TBD and for anything that we take out of the street fund or the general fund, it would seem like we'd want to go and understand, for the reasons that all of our cost estimates are really estimates anyway, why not bump it up and put in the design and contingency cost into those cost estimates at the very beginning, so that instead of talking about a $20 million plan, we're really looking at a $30 million plan, or whatever the numbers were coming out, understanding that there's a lot of stuff that we still don't know.
Yeah, I'll address that. The cost estimates are relative cost to help identify the band or area that it would be the cost of the projects. They haven't been flushed out. Mm-hmm. So it helps us to prioritize a bit as we're budgeting too on those. And as we add those projects to a budget process, we'll look at those in more detail and would add those costs. What's not included also, you have to remember, there's no O&M cost in these. These are just the capital cost. A lot of the stuff with the paint and the signs is going to bump up our operations and maintenance costs over the life cycles, because paint needs to be done every couple years. Signs have to be replaced every 10 years. So
One other question I had, thank you. One other question I had to do with the detail of the criteria and the rating system of that. And while I don't have it in front of me, what I recall was that there's some categories where there seems to be very, very large gaps between, say, like the conductivity column of the Texas corridor compared to some of the other ones that was getting like almost a 0 rating, where Texas was getting like I think it was a 46-point rating, and that just really elevated up the project. And I guess I wanted to get more information about how was that process on some of these columns addressed, because I didn't see anything in there about, we established criteria, but how were the criteria actually established and
I'm going to let Chris.
in the implementation of those criteria?
Chris, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So just speaking to the connectivity piece to start with, the model that was used it's a tool called Viocity, which is it's a GIS-based network modeling connectivity tool. It sits on top of like the kind of GIS platform that we operate here at the city. Transpo is the company that's developed that tool, and city has a long history of dealing with them on a variety of projects. It looks at the delta score on any given bike network link based on the before and
Delta
after.
meaning change.
Yeah, so
Not
right,
everyone knows
exactly.
delta
So
means
the net benefit, I guess, is what I'm going to say in connectivity is a comparison of the before and after for that project. So you may have I guess one example would be comparing the connectivity on Texas Street for a Bike Boulevard project versus a buffered bike lane on State Street. You're going to see a lot higher value, for instance, for Texas Street, because today there is no bike facility there, but we do have an existing bike lane on State Street. So it's already ranking fairly high from a connectivity standpoint, whereas Texas is ranking fairly low, and it does have a very large multifamily housing component. So there's a large user population there with no facility, which is why in that example you get a big boost when you add an actual bike facility there as a connection. So it's one of those things where it's not as easy as looking at what's the facility that's going in. It's a combination of the before and after. Is there a facility there? Is there a nearby parallel route? What's the orientation to the trips that are being modeled and the destinations that are being modeled? So it's one of those things where it's difficult to look at a single segment. You really need to look at the context of the entire network and the 30 destinations that we modeled. There's a discussion in Chapter 3 of, and then I think an accompanying graphic that shows kind of the 30 destinations that we used to load the network, and they're dispersed throughout the city in a kind of a regular pattern. So when you look at that, then some of the connections, you can start to see how the weighting was applied. But looking at any single project versus another individual project, sometimes it's not as intuitive as just saying, well, this one I think should be higher. It really depends on, like I said, even as something as simple as, was there an existing project 2 blocks away that was serving in a corridor function?
So using the Texas example, I guess in the 30 destinations that were plugged into the model, what would have been the destination on the eastern side of the corridor, of the Bike Boulevard corridor?
Just let me pull up a graphic here.
Outside of the multifamily housing.
So the blue dots are the 30 different destinations that we generalized a whole variety of. We had several hundred that were initially came out of the public input process, and we generalized them. So on Texas Street, what you're seeing Roosevelt Park here, which we put on there as a general indicator for, there's a Boys and Girls Club there, there's a neighborhood park that's significantly used by a lot of the population in that area, and also a very large multifamily housing component, all kind of concentrated within that area. And so the destinations that we would have been modeling would have been, for that area, connecting down through to the downtown, and then the next most likely destination would have been up to the Barclay Village area. So it would have been trips traversing through from northeast to southwest would have been probably the primary one. And then there would have been some that would have been heading to, destinations northwest of there, maybe to the James, Alabama intersection or further out.
Okay.
Yeah, Terry, the reason why I was bringing that one up was in the pedestrian master plan, there was a rating system that was applied, and to me, it seemed like some of them were, they did their best attempt at it, but some of them kind of missed the mark, and whether or not the neighborhoods themselves could go and help with that. And I understand the fact that you're looking at this as being a comprehensive citywide system. So too is the pedestrian part of it too. I mean, some of the sidewalk sheds, were very large, and like the example that I had pulled out, a pedestrian master plan was in the Birchwood neighborhood, and there was like a very large area that was served in sidewalks that was not connected because of these other factors that were applied to it, and it seemed like there needed to be a secondary review to those specific items. And I understand this is a first cut, and maybe it's going to, the model that you're using might end up having additional inputs later on once we understand this. But I was kind of surprised at some of the point variances between some of these projects, that they were so large, and it kind of favored one over another. And, like for instance, the State Street buffered lanes. Yes, we want to have something on Texas, but for the number of bicyclists that go and use State Street, there is a volume issue there. And do you want to go and try and provide a safer route for the people on State Street?
And we do have, like I said, there's the connectivity factor would have ranked that relatively low compared to Texas because of the existing facility, but we do have other factors in the matrix, like the demand would have bumped State Street up very high because of the population and the employment in that area, particularly the employment being the major employment area in the city, the downtown area. And you could see the kind of gravity that you give to that destination, and it effectively represented the same amount of weight as any 5 destinations relative to the rest of the map, and I think Fairhaven was 2.5 times. So we did give it a larger weighting.
Are each one of the columns weighted the same? Because it seemed like the connectivity seemed to be a lot more important than.
No, let me show you. There's a weighting that the steering committee and the staff and consultants all went through, and it was also based on public input from the open houses. So let me pull that up here.
In the meetings.
Yes, Mayor,
While Chris
while
is
we're waiting.
While Chris is going through his papers, just to remind the council, we had a steering committee, so the staff does the basic thoughtful work, and then we have the steering committee that gives public input. We have the meetings we had all around town where neighborhoods can give their input. We had, then it go through the transportation board, so that's made up of citizens that look at their specific bicycle interests. And one of our goals with that was also to get people who aren't on their bikes. And if you're on State Street, you're on your bike. And if you're in Texas Street, you're not on your bike maybe. So I think that was, for me, that was one of the goals of doing this and making it safer, is for the people that don't feel safe out on their bike. So I think that we got a lot of public input. Public input is essential to getting a good plan, but it doesn't always mean that everybody will be pleased with, when you look at it citywide, will think that it's Jefferson or Washington. That might be an issue. So I think the public the public was involved in doing this, and the neighborhoods were involved.
Yeah. I was at many of those meetings. I agree.
Chris?
So this shows you the relative ranking, and so here you can see the connectivity score, which is the one we had been talking about, was 45% of the overall priority rank on any given project. Demand, which again, the downtown would have had a large demand in that State Street example, was given 25%. And again, there's a variety of layers that play into that load that score. Equity was 15 and safety was 15. So they are different. They're differentiated based on the priority that came out of those two public open houses, the steering committee, the different focus groups, and then recommendations from staff. So it was kind of there was a lot of input on that. Getting kind of back to that, were people generally happy with it? The first open house, we had over 400 comments. People actually writing down either on a map or on one of the info sheets that we had or on one of the boards, and over 125 attendees. Second open house, right around 100 attendees, so still very well represented in a broad spectrum of people. We only had 61 comments, I think, at the second meeting. So we felt like the draft document, for the most part, people were pretty pleased with the direction we were going with that, and most of their concerns were addressed.
I do want to add one thing on the connectivity scoring. Note that it has I-5 barriers, and that's a key part of that Texas, Nevada, Kentucky Bike Boulevard, is that it is getting people across I-5, and that's something we heard from a lot of people about, was addressing that barrier.
Okay. Next question, Jack?
Yes. On wayfinding issues, it says in here that as more of the recommended network is developed, we will develop a hierarchy of destinations, identify decision points, and where to locate signs. So I understand that that's a particular approach. To me, it seems like it's a very long-term approach. If we're going to wait for the plan to evolve and work itself out, which might take 15 to 20 years, our wayfinding effort might be taking that long too. Another approach would be to establish exactly, we have our plan. We know exactly where we want to be and do. We may not have all the infrastructure in there, but we certainly can be starting to inform the community about where the wayfinding is, and that these routes are happening. They may not be the best routes for you to drive, to bike on right now because of, various problems, but that is the designated route, and you can get from point A to point B, not for just residents, but also for tourists too, by putting the wayfinding in there, which serves a couple things. One is it serves the bicyclists for sure, but it also, I think, segues into the pedestrian master plan and the greenways efforts that are happening, that we can actually have a multimodal wayfinding that makes sense that way, and to do the wayfinding sooner than later and not wait for the individual projects to be built is just my comment.
Right, and the wayfinding it's kind of a chicken and the egg. I've been talking with staff in Portland and also Seattle who implemented the wayfinding programs there, and they're ongoing, but they're very cautionary about implementing an extensive wayfinding system until you have more facility built, and the kind of the standard approach is to identify the routes, so where those connections are to your major destinations, and then fill in. But I think that we'll see as we implement the bicycle boulevards, those will be associated with wayfinding. So I think we'll see it come together more quickly than it first appears, but there is that kind of balance in terms of how much you sign and how much facility you have in there.
Do you have anything else on yours?
I yield to Michael.
What?
I yield to Michael.
Okay. We made it. Hey, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for the thorough answers. I'm not sure what order to take these in. Let's just start with in the order of the document then. I'm suggesting that it's both realistic and a good idea for us to consider accelerating the schedule of implementation. Based on my analysis in the memo, the amount of funding, the cost identified projects in the near term are 1.6 million, and we'll have way more than that. And the bulk of that will be spent then on those uncost identified difficult projects. But nonetheless, if we're going to be starting design right away on those more difficult things, I still think that we can turn this from a 20-year plan into a 15-year plan. And I'd like to actually see if the committee supports that. My understanding is the staff would almost like to take all the dates out of the plan and not make any date commitments at all. I can understand why, from a staff point of view, you don't want to make promises you can't keep. You're intimately involved in implementation and juggling of particular projects for particular reasons. But I think this is a council-level document, and I think as a matter of policy, I think that 15 years is both realistic and proportionate to how important this commitment is. So I don't know if either of you two want to respond to that, or if we want to hear actually that staff put their own reply in their own words first.
It's a motion, I'll respond, but
I would make a motion that, per my memo, we adjust the time periods for short-term, intermediate term, medium-term, and long-term to accelerate the proposed implementation from 15 years to 20 years for the entire plan.
okay, Mayor, and then
And I'll respond to that. I think that making that decision today, rather than making the decision in the context of the budget, which is coming up very quickly, I would recommend that you make that in the context of the full transportation budget to see how you'd like to, how that priority works, instead of making it in isolation. I agree, the sooner we can get it done, the better. And if we can get it done, if we put 20 years in and we can get it done in 10 years, that would be great. So if we want to look at the budget as a whole, which I know you do, you're the finance director and finance chair. You probably wish you were the finance director, but you're only the finance chair.
More headaches.
I would suggest that we leave 20 years in there until we see what the budget says, because that will be putting it in the context of the budget. And I think you've made your intentions very clear, and I agree with you. But I would be very uncomfortable to put the bicycle plan above any other transportation concern we have without seeing what they all are.
Right, but I'm not suggesting we put bicycle ahead of everything else. And also, with all due respect, I think it's a little bit backwards. Budget shouldn't drive our priorities. Our priorities should drive our budget. This is a prioritization policy level commitment, and it should come first, and then we should see if we can actually make the budget meet it.
Well, then I think we should, and I agree with you. You set the policy. This is a specific thing. You're not saying do it sooner. You're saying do it in 15 years. What I'm saying is there isn't the needs, all of our multimodal transportation needs in the city are great. We have many areas where we are below funding. If we choose to put that funding in for the PED plan, the bike plan, I think it should be done in the context of everything. Are you saying that the bike plan is more important than paving our roads?
I'm saying this is a dedicated source of funding which cannot be used for paving our roads even if we wanted to. And so given that these funds are already dedicated to non-motorized projects and there's no way we could spend them on anything else, this is not actually robbing Peter to pay Paul.
I think that's a good debate to have when we talk about the TBD funding, and the transportation priorities. So I would ask you to make that amendment when we get to the budget.
I don't
Jack?
think the TBD should be telling the
Jack?
city what to do.
Michael? Jack has,
You were going to be telling us, Michael.
we're taking turns on this stuff. It's not just one person jumping in. So Jack?
So I guess the way I see, we're setting up a master plan that's supposed to be out for a certain number of years, and that's what Michael, I think, is trying to address. Our budgets, we'll talk about a 2-year budget, within the next few months. And at best, we're going to talk about a 6-year capital budget. And we only go out 6 years on anything as far as making any sort of major commitments on our capital facilities or on our TIP or whatever. It's only 6 years out. I also look at the TBD, and we've got, maybe 5 years left on that, possibly 6. So that plus, hopefully, a re-up of the TBD for another 10 years, that would put it right about the same mark as what Michael's talking about, that if we could end up having, another 15 years worth of TBD funding, that we'd be able to implement nearly a majority of our bike master plan. And I think that there's some, I think there's some synergy as to what his idea is. But it is a planning document. It's a policy statement from the council that would, and I kind of agree with Michael, that it's informing the budget process.
And I understand that you want to spend the money on it. I would think that you would benefit from a real discussion with all the council members on the amount of money that's going into the non-motorized pot, not WTA, not paving, but the non-motorized pot for now, and understand all the needs that come out of that pot, and make sure that you can always reprioritize projects every year to make it go faster. But I believe that the council should have all the information to be able to make a decision, because I don't know who was saying we don't want to promise to do something we can't do. I feel like we absolutely want to do that. We want to say, this is our plan, this is our goal, this is how we're going to do it, and we're committing this. But I think it has to be done in context. So maybe there could be something you add to the plan, Michael, that is what you did on the watershed plan, where it's a 50-year and we can pay it out sooner if we can, or whatever I don't remember what the years were.
I'm still pushing for 30 years for the watershed.
Okay, well, even that, I mean, if we know that we have this amount of time, and we know we're committed to do it sooner, to dedicate the funds to do it sooner, then I think that we have the opportunity to still continue to weigh all our responsibilities in that area, because we also have a PED plan to implement. We have a lot of non-motorized needs. So if we could consider, you could consider something like that, so you leave the door open without making a commitment that we might not have the money for. I think that we would be more honest with the public.
And I'm going to have to agree with the mayor on this one. For us, this body, can't debate and assign TBD money. That's a separate board, and that relates to it. Yes, you may sit on it, but it is a totally separate board. And we have to have that discussion, about changing priorities or whatever within the context of the TBD board, not within the Public Works Committee. I also would love to see it accelerated, and if we can, and we can put in, I think, in the document that, if able, we would like that, is that kind of what we would like to see, but without changing those dates, because I think there's been a lot of work gone into the analysis of what can be accomplished, and quite frankly, I kind of trust our staff in terms of the kind of analysis that they've done, because they've done much deeper analysis than I am capable of doing. I have to, and with the Transportation Committee, Commission also going along with these kind of recommendations, so I'm not going to support it, Michael, but I appreciate where you come from with that, and I would like to see it. I'd like to see, but a lot of things. I'd like to see our plan like Copenhagen. But I would also like to have the taxing ability that they have to be able to fund it. And that becomes some of the differences, I think.
If you don't mind, Terry, I think that you could have a goal in there. Our goal is to achieve the plan sooner. Our goal is to achieve the plan sooner without promising that we're going to do it, without knowing what's going to happen in 15 years.
I don't think the plan says anywhere that we want to do it sooner.
I'm
I
saying
think
that
we
would be a
agree on
good.
that, but the plan doesn't say that.
Well, that would be a better amendment than changing the
That's what
date, in my opinion.
And that I could support. Jack, you had your?
I don't have any hand up, but
Okay, I thought it, okay.
I've got opinions, but I don't have my hand up.
Okay, Michael?
I'll just say one more thing. I agree with you, Mayor. It's important to look at it in context. I have sort of looked at some of the numbers. For the TBD, for non-motorized alone, we're probably going to have about 9.6 million. I'm ballparking because we don't know what sales tax will be. 9.6 million is more than enough to get the first 5 years' work done, especially when we're talking about 1.6 million for all of the cost estimated short-term projects over the next 5 years. I'd also note we're spending $2.5 million on a single pedestrian project right now. The scale that we're talking about for what we've already spent on pedestrian projects dwarfs the already cost-identified medium-term projects here in the pedestrian plan. I don't think it's imbalanced. I do think I looked at proportions and numbers. I do think it's realistic to accelerate. So I'd still like to get a vote on my recommendation, and we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Anybody else on the motion? Okay, we have a motion before us to accelerate the plan to 15 years from 20 years. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
And I say no, so it'll be mixed recommendations. Okay, next.
First of all, let me say thank you for that, and even more particularly thanks for the staff and the mayor who agree that sooner would be better if it's realistic. So let's hope it is realistic. The second issue has to do with protected versus unprotected bike lanes. I noted that the plan barely has any protected bike lanes listed, and specifically only 4 miles of buffered bike lanes and less than a mile of cycle track. However, the staff's response was basically that many of the further study needed areas might be candidate areas for separated bicycle facilities. And the current recommendations don't preclude going to a higher level facility like a cycle track or protected bike lane in the future. So that addresses a lot of my concerns. There might be some they're hidden in the sense that they're not defined yet. And so that was very helpful to hear. Nonetheless, I still think there is a problem that in our current transportation element of our comp plan and all throughout this, there is a clear assumption that bike lanes go along arterials. It's almost kind of just assumed. If you read my memo, I understand the necessity for bike lanes along arterials because they're often just the best, most continuous connected route. There's no other place to put it. Nonetheless, I would like our planning documents to recognize that we should look for alternatives when at all possible. I have drafted up, and I apologize for the coffee stains, I have drafted up a possible new additional policy. And it basically is a new policy that's in the safety section, and it simply says, look for alternatives when possible for dedicated bike lanes and cycle tracks to be that are not located on busy arterials to enhance rider comfort, safety, and reduce exposure to vehicle exhaust. I sincerely believe that we need to look for those alternatives when possible. The actions, I'm not so sure about. I made those up this morning. They're probably not all that well written, but I am sincerely committed to that policy. And I would note that we already have room for that kind of flexibility in our most recent downtown sub-area plan, where we say physically separated or protected bike lanes should be located within or parallel to arterial streets in dedicated parts of the right-of-way. I mean, in our downtown plan, and I think also our downtown plan, Samish Way, Fountain District, areas which are not yet developed, I think there may be room to find these alternatives, or at least we should look for the alternatives. So what I would move is that we add a new policy which simply suggests that we should look for alternatives. It doesn't say that we have to or should, or even that they're the best thing to do, but I would like to at least introduce a policy that we need to look for those alternatives. So that may be too soon for reaction. I'm sorry I didn't have this available before the weekend.
Well, the staff hasn't seen this yet, and I think they need to look at it. I think there's some there's common sense in what you're saying. I would be a little uncomfortable putting specifics in, but I would think that the staff at least needs a chance to be able to respond to the memo. So could that happen tonight?
Sure.
Yeah. And
Please.
it is really, really clear that we're going to have another session, and maybe we'll have to have a special session for it. Because looking at the clock right now, we have officers here that have come for the parking issue, and I think it's probably going to take at least 20 minutes. I can't imagine not, you know. So I'm going to close the discussion on this for right now, and we'll have to have another work session to continue with this. Staff will get a chance to look at your latest. If there's other stuff that comes up, you know, please get it to staff so that they can do, and we can read it thoroughly, their
Clean
responses.
copy without coffee? I will email you that document too.
Yeah. Yeah, and because I think we need to move on to the next item so we can at least start on that issue. If that's okay, is that okay with committee? Okay, and we will set up another look at a work session on our next time. Yeah. Okay, and staff, thank you very much for, you know, you did a great job on your answers and your timeliness in getting them out to us, and so we had a chance to read through your responses and stuff over the weekend. I think I really appreciate that. Thank you. So our next item is, what is our next item is a proposed ordinance amending Title 11 of the Bellingham Municipal Code relating to parking. Non-controversial item. I like those.
I would hope so. Good morning, Mr. Mortimer, members of the
Yes.
committee. My name is Eric Johnston. I'm the Assistant Public Works Director. I have responsibility over the parking division, operations side of things. In the audience today, we have a couple of folks who've been instrumental in working on this parking proposed ordinance for the last year or so. Specifically, want to note the members of the Transportation Commission, Mr. Jim McCabe and Mr. Tim Hostetler are here. Dennis James from the Police Department, who's the traffic sergeant, has responsibility over the parking enforcement officers. Ms. Darlene Peterson, who's the court administrator, has responsibility for administering the tickets. And then Clark Williams, as well as Opal Mahoney from the parking division operations staff. All of these folks have been working on this for about a year now. Certainly want to acknowledge their participation and appreciate them being here this morning. So the ordinance that you have in your packet this morning does cover a couple of different topics. If I might get my computer work here. Also don't want to forget Matt Stamps sitting to my right. Put a fair amount of time into this as well. Parking, of course, can often be a topic of great conversation. Would expect over the next year or so, if not longer, that we will continue to have more conversations about parking. As we were talking with the Transportation Commission, a number of topics came up that warrant additional discussion. You'll note in their resolution recommending approval of the ordinance to specific items related to additional topics for parking. But we'll note here that as we talk over the next year or so, as we get into the next budget cycle in the next month, we will be having some significant discussions about improvements to the parkade in downtown. We are looking over the next year or two to find more efficiencies in how enforcement is done. And that we will be incorporating more technology into the use of the parking system from an operations standpoint. So today's ordinance, the proposed ordinance, is more of a step one as we look at more issues related to parking. And those issues might include the addition of electric vehicle parking stations in the parkade or other parking areas within the downtown, the use of technology for pay by cell phone technology or variable rates, or additional enforcement tools that might come up as things move down the road. Would certainly be willing to address questions related to that today, but I would expect we have more conversation about that in the future, particularly with the Transportation Commission. Specifically related to the proposed ordinance, there's a staff memo that's incorporated in the agenda packet. It covers most of those topics fairly succinctly. I would like to mention a couple of things in three particular areas. First is the major policy change for the city, which is the change from 24 to 72-hour parking. And while that is probably the minor text revision in the ordinance, it's probably the most significant policy change for the city to consider. And this comes largely at the input from a couple of council members as well as to the Transportation Commission looking to make a change to encourage a mode shift and allow people who are choosing to walk or take the bus or to ride their bicycles the opportunity to leave their vehicle parked on residential streets for a longer period of time. That did present some operational challenges for the city. We were able to find ways around those. But the major policy change with this proposed ordinance is that change from 24 to 72-hour on-street parking. The second major portion of the proposed ordinance are administrative changes. These are largely things that have just been reflective of how we've been doing business over the last couple of years, or changes that were needed resulting from other ordinance changes that needed to be cleaned up. Specifically, well, as an example, parking in the off-street parking areas. It used to be that when we had full-time staff, you had to pay as you entered the parkade. Now that the full-time staff has gone, you have to pay with the parking station. We would like that to be paid as you leave rather than as you enter. There's an assumption related to the posting of time-limited parking. Prior to the creation of the Transportation Commission, there were some ordinances that were put in place that allowed the staff to make administrative limits on parking time limits. That was taken out of the ordinance when the Transportation Commission was created and the Parking Commission was eliminated. That's being restored within this ordinance. We think that's appropriate to do that. That's done under the auspices of the traffic engineer and the direction of the Public Works Director. And then lastly, the other major change in the administration portions are the penalties for parking infractions. We're proposing that these would be increased $10 each, so from $10 to $20 for the overtime or meter violations, and then $20 to $30 for all other violations. There's some other changes within the ordinance related to violations of disabled parking stations, largely to reflect changes in state law. Note that this change or an increase in the fine is helping to cover our costs. Consistent with council policy and other items, we felt it would be appropriate to matching up the cost of doing business with the cost of the fines that are issued. So the cost of issuing and processing a citation, parking citation, is around $19. These costs would then hopefully cover those costs for the city. The last item is related to what we refer to as the scofflaw list. And this is intended to help us be more efficient in processing and collecting on citations that are issued to people who are in violation of the parking ordinances as they may be. Currently, if you are issued more than 4 citations, the city does have the ability in the current code to tow a vehicle, but only if it's being observed in a current parking violation. So if you have 5 tickets and have not paid them, but are legally parked, there's nothing the city can do for a legally parked vehicle. The change here will be to allow the staff, to allow our parking enforcement officials to tow a vehicle who has more than 4 unpaid citations, regardless of whether the vehicle is observed in a citation, in a violation or not. Other than that, the changes are not substantive. There are some provisions to allow for unpaid citations to be collected before the vehicle is released from the impound yard. However, the change in practice is not significant, other than that it allows for vehicles to be towed whether they are in violation of the code or not. They still have to pay the tickets. Prior to the vehicle being released from the impound yard, this is the other minor change, is that before a vehicle is released, the impound yard is obligated to ensure that either the citations have been paid in full or that a payment plan has been established with the court. So it does add a little bit more administrative burden onto the city. However, the collection of those unpaid fines is important and is worth the effort to do that.
So is it paid to the city or paid to the collection agency?
Paid to the city or the collection agency if it has been turned over to collections. The end result is that something needs to be paid prior to being released from the impound yard.
Okay.
Yes, there is an opportunity to have a payment plan, and those can be established at any time with the court, whether that's through a collection agency or whether with the court directly.
With the payment plan, if you establish a payment plan and you pay the towing, can you get your car out? Or does your car stay there until it's all paid off?
The vehicle is retained until either they are paid off or a payment plan has been established. If you establish a payment,
Okay.
if your vehicle gets towed, you find out it's been towed, the towing company says, we're not going to release your vehicle until you deal with the city. You then approach the city, establish a payment plan, or pay the citations. Then the release is provided to the towing company, and the towing company will release your vehicle.
Okay.
For a ticket or for the city? So the mayor asked the question about how much money we're talking about in terms of uncollected fine. In the hundreds of thousands of dollars on an annual basis is how many are not being collected or are currently outstanding. I think I've got that right. it's a significant amount of money. However, the point here is not to increase the city's coffers. This is revenues that are intended to cover the cost of enforcement. We know that enforcement is not going to be 100% cost recovery. The goal of the enforcement is to drive folks to, or encourage folks to be compliant with the law, which is to pay the meters. The hope is that by more effective enforcement that you're pushing people to be responsible citizens and pay for the metered parking. We would expect we'll get a short increase in fine revenue as people were brought into compliance, but that's not expected to be long-term. Again, the goal is to be forcing or encouraging people to pay for the metered parking.
Michael?
First, I want to thank you, Eric, for making that point. I think sometimes people in the public think that we make money off of parking fines, and they're not a money maker. As you say, our goal is just to cover our costs. So that I'm glad you made that point. I also want to say thank you for the change in the parking rule, which was a disincentive for people leaving the car behind and biking or taking the bus. And I'm glad we removed that disincentive. And in general, I think there's a nice long list of reforms in our parking system. I do have one question on the collections. We received a letter from a constituent who said that, unfortunately, in years past, they did run up a number of tickets, and it's gone to collections. And this person would like to find a way to pay it back. But they were saying that because it's gone to collections, the collection company doesn't feel like they have flexibility, that their hands are tied by the city's rules. Do you know whose hands are tied? Can the collection company actually be flexible in coming up with a payment plan? Because if they think we're being inflexible, then and we think I don't know whose problem it is. But if here's a willing person who wants a payment plan, is there actually a barrier or isn't there?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm able to answer that right now. I think maybe Darlene Peterson maybe help me with that a little bit, I hope. If not, I think the city, if we have the ability to, would find a way to be flexible with folks. Our goal is not to be punitive. It's really to help people come into line with.
So to be clear,
their
the person wrote that the terms that the collections agency said that the terms were decided by the municipality, so they were unable to offer any flexibility. And I don't know if that's true or not. And this is only for those that go to collections.
Hi there. I'm Darlene Peterson. And what I can tell you is that we have a plan set up with Alliance One, who is our collection company. There are amounts that are determined about how much a person has to pay, but they're very reasonable. And as far as anybody who is interested, once you start making payments, automatically you're back in compliance. So if somebody sincerely wants to make payments, it's a phone call and you can set up payments and be back in compliance.
What are very reasonable is what's reasonable to one is if you got next to nothing.
Right. I don't have the contract with me. We have a specific contract that is set up. I apologize. I didn't think to bring that with me.
I would like to get that information because I do think it makes a difference for some people. I know they get into that position. And from Michael, everything that's not paid goes to collections. So we're talking about all of these will be through collections, not through the city, because that's.
I can bring that for this evening.
Because that would be, that does make a difference in terms of how I view that part as well. It is important.
The concern right now is that when somebody who's on this scofflaw list has a violation, they have to pay the towing company, and they have to pay a $100 administrative fee that goes to the police department. They pay nothing on the ticket. So they can come up with the money to pay the towing company, they can come up with the money to pay the fee, but not anything is going towards the original ticket. And I will get that information tonight about what the Alliance One rate is.
I would very much also like to see a breakdown on how the money from tickets in the downtown is spent, broke down in terms of percentage of people, within the court system, to see how that money is spent, and money that's spent on enforcement outside the district as well, and how that's paid before I is doubling the tickets in the downtown. And the downtown's the only place we got parking. So Fairhaven's, you know, people go to Fairhaven, people go to the mall, people go everywhere else, and they're complaining about the parking in the downtown, and we're talking about doubling it. So I know from merchants' point of view, many of them, you know, we're again penalizing the downtown merchants, and in this case, it's not to keep things moving along as much as they're not increasing the parking rates, it's to pay for our court and enforcement staff. So I would really like to see the breakdown on that to make sure, so I can be sure that money from that is not going to pay other parts of courts staff and traffic fees and, you know, fines or enforcement kinds of things. So I would, before I can vote on that, I would really like to see that kind of a breakdown on how that money's spent and what percentage of staff time is used from the tickets in the downtown.
We can certainly do that, whether that be at another committee meeting or whether that's for tonight. I think we could be prepared to get close to that. An Opal will correct me if I get this wrong, but if I recall correctly, around 85% of the tickets are issued in the downtown, but only 65% of the revenue is coming from tickets is coming from the downtown sources. We know that in general, I think last year we spent around $750,000 in enforcement activities. That's cost to both the court and to the police department. Fine revenue in total coming in was around $600,000. So about $100,000 loss, if you will, on that enforcement activity. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, provided that you're pushing people to be compliant with paying for the meters. However, we do know that there's a significant number of citations that are left uncollected.
Yeah, that part, yeah.
So can we get a more fine breakdown? That might be a little difficult to get 100% precise, but in general terms, we know, and I think I've got that right. Close around 85% of tickets being issued are from the downtown area, but about 65% of the revenue is from the downtown.
And you want to know where the expenditure is?
Yes, I want to see, you know, because I know when we have part of the money that's coming from the tickets go to pay the staff that are handling it, but how much of that staff time goes to, or this money goes to pay staff, and how much of their time is spent on other things, and is it you know, just to make sure that's we're not subsidizing any other parts of the court.
Yeah, the way that the funding for the court and for the police department comes for parking enforcement activities is every year through the budget, there's an allocation that's developed by the police department and by the court system. And within the court system, and Darlene can speak to this more than I can, but there are a certain number of full-time employee equivalents, FTEs, that are assigned to processing and managing the over 37,000 parking citations that are issued every single year. There's a number of accounting technicians, a number of court processing technicians, as well as a percentage of the judge's time to be able to plan for that. Those numbers include staff time, wages, benefits, the cost of computers, the cost of facilities as well. Within the police department, there are 4 dedicated parking enforcement officers. Their salaries and wages or benefits are paid out of the parking fund as well. They are tasked with doing parking-related activities. The police department may use them from time to time with an emergency that may come up related to some traffic control, but by and large, the vast majority of their time is dedicated to parking enforcement activities. There are, some, as would be expected, some supervisory responsibilities. A portion of the traffic sergeant's time is dedicated to parking, but those are fairly minimal in terms of their scope. To be able to break down where they spend their time in terms of how much time and effort they're putting into doing enforcement, that 85% rule or number of spending 85% of the tickets being issued in downtown would have to presume that those are reflective of the amount of time being spent. That 85% of the officers' time is spent in downtown, with the balance being spent in enforcement activities outside of downtown, with a minimal, if de minimis, effort being spent on issues not directly related to parking.
Yeah. I don't necessarily agree with the 85% of the time, because it takes much more time to go down to Fairhaven and up through the neighborhoods, and it does go downtown and just go do.
Sure.
So that the time-wise, but I would like to see that kind of breakdown. I think I'm kind of in agreement with the other recommendations. Like Michael, I'm really happy to see the change, you know, the 72 hours, the scuffle, as long as there's a reasonable payment plan, so that, because that does concern me about, yeah. And so that I agree with, but this, doubling parking costs downtown, and I want to see the breakdown before I'm willing to jump on that one. Jack?
I'm very supportive of the work that was done on this. I did have a kind of a detailed type question on, this is on page 85 of the packet. It's section 9, subsection A, and it has to do with disabled parking infractions. And it's talking about that there's going to be an additional civil penalty imposed of $200, and then it says, any reduction in any penalty or and assessment imposed under the subsection will be applied proportionally between the penalty and the assessment. It's my understanding that there are no reductions in disabled parking infractions, that it's 250 and you cannot argue it down at the court level. Is that? Yeah.
Darlene can probably speak to that better. I thought you were going to ask about the amounts and how it's allocated, and that's all taken right from the RCW. But Darlene might be able to answer your question, perhaps.
I apologize, but I'm going to have to check with my judicial officer on that.
Okay.
I will have that answer for you tonight.
Well, I have to confess something here, is that I got nailed for parking in a disabled parking. And it's not something I'm all proud about, but I have a beater truck that had a transmission that went out, and I ended up going to the Hagen Parkley parking lot, and I'm coasting, and I only have a certain amount of momentum, and I had to try and find a parking spot real quick. All of the parking spots were taken except for the disabled. And so I parked in the disabled, and I went and made the phone call to go and get a tow truck. And by the time I got the tow truck there, literally within about 40 minutes, I got tagged, and I could not reduce it. So,
I'll have an answer for you tonight.
thank you.
I think there's a couple things we can answer tonight. I think the breakdown that you're asking for, Terry,
Yeah.
we might not be able to have specifically by
Right.
tonight.
And it does kind of look like, since we're out of time for a committee, that we'll probably have to set this one over to for another work session.
Sure.
As well. So we will set this over to our next, for another work session until we get the information. Is that okay with committee? Because we're out of time. So at this point, the committee's adjourned.
What about the item number 4?
What, water use efficiency
Oh.
program? The reason why a few people are in the audience are...
Oh, man. That's what I was afraid of, running so much time on the bicycle, but, okay. Well, can we run this one this evening?
How long's your presentation, Anitra?
Maybe this evening.
I could do 10 minutes, but...
I can, gonna run it short, but I can do 10 minutes, I guess, and 'cause I got an appointment. Kind of set it based on our committee times. We're not moving very fast. Okay. Okay, if we can do it in 10 minutes.
Yeah, and actually, I provided in the agenda packet a summary of
Yeah.
one of the
So-
slides.
I'm
so-
sorry about that. I missed it. I thought we just had 3, otherwise I would have cut us off earlier.
How do
I do apologize. Thank you for catching that for me. because
Well, I can't get the,
Yeah, I just didn't see it over on the...
how come this isn't coming up? Should just come up really quick.
Better than I can. Well, by the way of introducing this topic, my name is John Hutchings with Public Works, and the purpose today is to give you a brief overview of the City of Bellingham's water use efficiency program that stems from the state's municipal water law. The utility retains
Anitra as Water Conservation Manager that implements this program in a way that provides positive outcomes to our customers, the utilities customers, in the way of reducing water use throughout the city. And Anitra's intent today is to show how this program has been successful over the course of the last 5 years, and then to propose a follow-up set of goals and measures for the next 5-year planning period. So what we're doing is responding to the state law, but doing it in a way that has direct positive public benefit here in Bellingham. So what we are asking of you is some direction at the close of this to move forward with scheduling a public hearing to contemplate, to get some public input on the scope of these goals and measures for the next 5 years of this program. With that, I'll turn it over to Anitra.
Thank you. Anitra Achituro, Public Works. As John said, so this is a state requirement from the Washington State Department of Health. That was the water use efficiency program is also known as the municipal water law. So we just finished our first 6-year program period, which is the requirement by the State Department of Health. And I'm going to give you a summary of that, which you should also have in your agenda packet, and then a brief overview of our consumption data over the last several years, and then the proposed goals and measures for this next 6-year program planning period. So all water suppliers of the state in Washington State are required to have a water use efficiency program to some degree. So our requirements, which are kind of an extension and a more focus of the water comprehensive plan. We collect the data, forecast demand, evaluate our measures, calculate distribution system leakage, and implement our water use efficiency program. For the distribution leakage standard, this is a requirement that we'll need to meet 10% or less, and then also production and service meter requirement, this is where the mandatory water metering was born. And then also another major component of the water use efficiency program is just goal setting and performance reporting. So what I'm going to show you in a few minutes is just a summary of what those 2 goals were previously and those measures, the evaluation that came out of that, and then what we're proposing for this next 6-year period. And just to give you a brief breakdown, so I kind of act as the data collector from all the different consumption. There's a bunch of disparate parts. The water use efficiency program requirement actually has been really great in corralling all the different data sets throughout the city, and then into this water balance, which is adopted from the American Water Works Association. So we take our system input volume from the water treatment plant, and then it goes into 2 different branches: authorized consumption and then water losses, and then you can see the further breakdowns. So this is how I'm categorizing and tabulating all our citywide consumption data. And then the end results are revenue water and then non-revenue water. And that distribution leakage standard, we're not required, that's 10% or less system-wide. We are not required to have that in place or meet that threshold until we're fully metered. So we still have until 2017 to do that. I'm still tracking it, but we're not required to report on it. And I should say, too, as part of the water use efficiency requirements, we're required to submit a report annually on what our annual consumption was for the past year and then how we're doing on these goals and measures. So this summary, as I indicated in the paperwork in the agenda packet, we did achieve our 2 goals, and we are doing quite well on our consumption. It's pretty amazing, actually, and I think this next, it'll come later, but I'll show you a little bit later how our consumption is actually really healthy and down both peak demand and average daily demand. So for this last program period, 2008 to 2013, focused the programs or the measures really on spreading out the equity between these three top using customer classes, both flat rate and metered single-family residential, multifamily, and commercial. So as you can see, out of our 26,000 customers, about 19,000 of them are residential, single-family residential. So they comprise the majority of the customer base and the consumption. So the programs that we have done, the measures that we did the past 6 years really kind of reflect these three different sectors. So our summary of the measures, as you saw in the packet, the great thing about the water use efficiency program for the state is that the goals are pretty firm. They have to have a measurable and quantitative figures tied to them. But the measures, you can state them, but they can be kind of you can massage them throughout the 6-year period. So we did put in for toilet retrofit, but we extended that to include clothes washers because the state was also doing a rebate, and it allowed for maximization of what people want to do for their own water use efficiency efforts. So with that, we had just over 250 rebates processed, about 18 million gallons of water savings, and then we had spent over that program period about $130,000 on rebates. And prior to implementing that this rebate project, we did a pilot study just to kind of gauge how to carry that out, and researched how other utilities in the area are doing their programs.
Actually, I think we're going to run out of time pretty quickly. So.
Oh, I am. Okay, so if you guys have any questions on this, but otherwise it's in your packet. So, but what I really want to get to here is this consumption data. So you can see we're on a downward trend. We're below 10 million gallons per day over the last several years. And we did see this in the late 90s, but we're really wanting to continue seeing that trend and not have it go back up again. So for the proposed goals for 2014 and 19, we want to maintain that average daily demand at under 10 million gallons per day for this period. I think this is reasonable and achievable. And then for the second goal, we want to keep our peak day demand down between the June and August months when it is the highest to 14 million gallons per day or less. And since 2009, we've actually been under this 14 or under. So again, that's, I think, reasonable and achievable. And then for what we're proposing for these measures are to extend the rebates over this next 6-year period to not just those top three, but to irrigation, industrial, and institutional water customers, because there are high users spread out throughout the customer classes, but I think including those other customer classes will tease out and also reach out to those high users and offer some assistance. And then number 7, partner with our nonprofit agencies, as I've been doing the last 2 years. It really maximizes staff time and resources and budget when we can work with them that have similar goals and do more cross-pollination. Continue demonstration projects with the community. Number 9, develop system-wide water use efficiency cost-benefit analysis. That'll come later on after we're fully metered. And then, again, 10, reduce water treatment plant operational water use, and that's via our DAF system. So these are proposed for this next 6-year period. And this is just another little clarifying slide on rebates, where the numbers came from and the budget amounts that have been requested in the past and going forward. I think that's it. The really quick version.
Michael.
I think there's some missing elements to the goals and the measures that we're already doing, and I think I'd like to see them reflected somehow. That has to do with rainwater recovery, purple pipe systems, gray water practices. All of these things, to the extent that we implement them and put them in our plans, can help meet those goals by keeping down consumption, especially some of the stuff that might help with irrigating with gray water, which would keep down summer consumption. Is there some some way, maybe in item number 8 up there, or other areas where we can reflect what we're doing on changing practices with regard to gray water and water recovery and things like that?
Yeah, and actually, the demonstration projects have been primarily on rainwater harvesting. So I think it would be too challenging to incorporate other, so it's not stated outright. And that's, again, making it general enough in the measure so you can kind of have some flexibility as you go through the 6-year period of when you see certain opportunities or new information comes up or whatever that we need to want to focus on, that you're not locked into doing what was stated specifically in the measure. So,
The purple pipe type systems, which is really a rule change, but it helps out.
yeah, and in the previous 6-year period, that fell under this measure 9. I think it was continue existing public outreach measures, which included all the rainwater harvesting and sustainable water management. So, I mean, we can modify one of these measures to include something of the sorts regarding sustainable water management, which would encompass gray water reuse, rainwater.
Sure, I just think we're doing things we would want to be able to recognize and include.
Okay.
Jack and then Kelly.
Anitra, with the conversion of the water meters that we're currently doing, do you have any initial information data that is coming in as to what the net effect is between the flat versus the metered?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing in the sense that we have 4,000 meters that were installed and turned on this past January, and for this first group, and over 50%, just over 50% of these customers were using 12 CCF or less, and our flat rate, I believe, is based on 22 CCF or less.
Wow.
So there's been a real fear around metering, but over half of these folks are really using half of what we assume they would be using. So quite frankly, a lot of the conservation is really going to come through passive like metering, and then with the toilet rebates, we're going to, I expect it to see it continue to maintain or go even down a little bit more.
Cool.
So.
Mayor Kelly?
And I think it's helpful to have the overall goal, Michael, that the council has set, and as we bring projects forward, we know that, I mean, I think it sounds like there's more information that would be helpful for the council to know about what we're doing now and what the plan is, so that we maintain that flexibility and don't have to change the rules in the middle of trying to save water. So maybe Anisha could come back.
Yeah. So staff, do we need a motion to set a public hearing?
That is what we would request of you.
So moved.
Okay, so we have a motion before us to set a public hearing, and so we'll probably do staff working with Marie on setting that. All those in favor, answer aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. We got a public hearing. If you work with Marie, we'll set a time for that, and thank you.
Thank you.
Again, I apologize.
Oh, no, it's okay.
I didn't want to
No
rush you,
worries.
but we know we're, yeah.
Okay.